This video provides an overview of using the Automation Director REST API to invoke a service. Because many of the Automation Director services use features provided by other members of the XP8 IMS family, deploying and configuring the XP8 IMS OVA is the quickest solution to get started. Once the XP8 Intelligent Management Suite has been deployed and configured for your environment, you are then ready to start using the Automation Director REST API. Invoking an Automation Director service using the REST API involves a number of steps. These steps may be a call to the REST API or processing the response from a previous call. Let's now take a look at each step in turn. Before we can use the Automation Director REST API, we first need to authenticate ourselves with the IMS server. The credentials we use must therefore be verifiable by the IMS server. For example, this may be a local account or integration with your existing LDAP server. The IMS server then provides us with the authentication token we will need to use when calling the Automation Director REST API. Before we can invoke a service, we need to obtain its unique service ID. As Automation Director has a large catalogue of services, we need to perform a search for the service we wish to invoke. Notice how the search filter argument needs to be correctly encoded for inclusion as part of the URL. Having found the required service and obtained the unique service ID, we can proceed to the next step. Armed with the unique service ID, we can now obtain further details about the specific service. The response will be a JSON object that includes all possible parameters relevant to that individual service. Before we can invoke the service, we need to prepare the parameters. Depending on the nature of the service to be invoked, the JSON object can be quite large. However, not all of the properties need to be updated. The quickest way to understand which of the properties are mandatory to invoke any given service is to use the Automation Director web interface and submit a service manually. As you step through the workflow, you will be able to make a note of which properties must be supplied by the user invoking the service. The Automation Director REST API User and Reference Guide provides details of every parameter for every pre-supplied service. Having updated the service properties JSON object, we can now call the Automation Director REST API to invoke the service. The URL we need to make that call to invoke the service is handily provided within the service properties JSON object that we already have. We include the updated service properties JSON object as part of this call, thereby providing all of the required parameters the service will need. If Automation Director REST API accepts the invocation request, then in response, the REST API will provide the task number for our request. This task number is now our key to monitoring the status of the running task. Because the duration of a task will depend on its complexity, the resources it requires, and potentially any user input, we will need to monitor its progress. We therefore need to code a loop within which we will periodically call the REST API to check on the status of our task. Our code will continue to loop until the task status returns as either completed or failed. As part of our loop, we will also need to ensure that our authentication token has not expired. Should the authentication token expire, then we just need to request a new one, just as we did in the first step of this process. We can leave our loop once the task returns as either completed or failed. At this point, we then need to obtain the final completion status for the task. This will be a large JSON object containing everything and more that we need to know about the task that was just performed. In the next video, we will look at the code required for each step.